Why didn't Pompeii evacuate? Obviously there wasn't a siren like we have today in situations of disaster. The human brain essentially boils. There were people who would have been vaporised. I'm Daisy Dunn and I'm here with History Hit answering the most Googled questions on Pompeii. Why is Pompeii famous? Well, Pompeii is famous because of the way it came to an end. It was buried over by this disastrous eruption of Vesuvius in the 1st century AD, and we often speak of it as being a city that's been frozen in time, so we know it a lot better than we do most other cities in the ancient world. Was Pompeii part of the Roman Empire? Yes, it was. Pompeii had actually grouped together with a lot of other Italian cities and towns back in 91 BC to fight the Social War, which was a civil war against Rome. But since then, it had been incorporated into it and relations between the two were pretty good. Was Pompeii named after Pompey? So speaking here about Pompey the Great, great sort of general who was fighting sort of an ally and then an enemy of Julius Caesar. He existed a long time after Pompeii was named. So no, Pompeii was not named after Pompey. We think its name probably derived rather from the idea of there being 5 different cities. So Pompey, in one of the ancient Italic languages, refers to 5 different towns. So we think it's a sort of compilation of those places, so nothing to do with Pompey the Great. Next question. How important was Pompeii? Well, Pompeii was arguably more important to us today than it was to the Roman Empire in its own time. A lot of historians talk about it as being quite an average ancient city. It was one of many that formed the Bay of Naples. There was Herculaneum nearby, there was Stabia, there were lots of other places. It was larger than a lot of those places and it definitely had a lot of trade, but it wasn't hugely significant to the Roman Empire and its functioning as a whole. Next question. What did Pompeii look like before the eruption? Well, this is a question that's going to be better for a Google image search than it is just for a straight Google search, because if you do that, you'll be able to pull up a number of really good ground plans, maps, and 3D reconstructions based on the archaeological evidence, because we're able to see pretty much what Pompeii did look like at the time of the eruption. It was quite built up. There were a number of villas, there were a number of blocks where people lived, there were temples, there were bars, there was an amphitheatre. It was a really well-functioning, built-up city. The one big difference was the volcano itself. It is known today for having these sort of 2 peaks. Before the eruption, it was much more sort of whole. It looked much more like a mountain with a single peak. So the volcano itself is the biggest difference. Next question. Who lived in Pompeii? Well, Pompeii was home to a huge variety of different people. There were really rich people, there were merchants, there were the poor, there were a lot of slaves, men, women, children. It was very, very diverse. But we know from a lot of recent research looking at the DNA that a lot of people who were living there had ancestral origins in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it seemed like that a lot of people came to settle in Pompeii rather than actually having been born there themselves. A lot of wealthy Romans also had holiday homes in Pompeii. Pompeii was not, however, home to the emperor and his family. The really interesting thing with Pompeii, unlike some other ancient cities, is that we can actually identify some of the residents who were there. So we know that there was a very well-regarded, wealthy woman called Julia Felix, for example, who was behind some of the great building programs in the city. We know the names of lots of freedmen or former slaves who had managed to find their own sort of wealth and build amazing houses. So we speak of the house of the WWII, for example. There are some brothers who were able to use their wealth and sort of establish themselves quite prominently within Pompeii. So inscriptions can actually bring us quite close to a lot of the people who were there. Why didn't Pompeii evacuate? Well, actually, there were some quite good efforts to evacuate Pompeii. Obviously there wasn't a siren like we have today in situations of disaster, but we know from looking at the remains of humans that we've discovered so far that there are about 1,200 of them, and the population of Pompeii was somewhere between 10 and 20,000, which is a huge window. So our best guess would be between 12 and 15,000. And it's true that there are still parts of Pompeii which are still unexcavated. So there are likely still human remains down there, and there are some which will have vanished completely. But even given that, it seems unlikely that that number of 1,200 victims will go up excessively. So it would appear that a lot of people did manage to escape from Pompeii. Those who didn't escape, there might have been a huge number of reasons why. They might have been too old to run away, they might have been too young, they might have been too infirm. There would also have been people who would have been sort of crushed on the way out and just failed escape attempts. But some people might have decided sort of philosophically that it would have been more sensible to stay put than to run. Because if you think about it, the volcano was raining down a huge amount of pumice and stones and really kind of heavy debris. There was a real danger of being struck on the head, of buildings coming down, of roofs collapsing. If you're running out in the open, it might seem a lot more dangerous than actually staying put and finding cover. And we find that a lot of the people who were within buildings, the people who've been found, they were sort of trying to sort of huddle together, in safe spaces. In the nearby city of Herculaneum, for example, a lot of people were found huddled together within these boat stores. So people typically went to places where they thought that maybe the structure of the building itself might give them some protection from the volcano. So you can see that that might have been one way of thinking. Other people decided it was safer to run. So people would have been divided just as they would be today. Did Pompey know Vesuvius was a volcano? Probably not. The evidence for this is really quite interesting. Pliny the Younger, who was the survivor of the eruption, he wrote these great eyewitness accounts of it. He had an uncle called Pliny the Elder. And Pliny the Elder, before he died in the eruption, he wrote one of the earliest encyclopedias of natural history in the ancient world. And he had a whole section on volcanoes within this book. And he described volcanoes all over the world. He described Mount Etna in Sicily. He described volcanoes in Persia, in Ethiopia. But there's no Vesuvius in the volcano section of his encyclopedia, where he does describe Vesuvius. He describes it simply as a mountain that's watered by a particular river called the River Sarno. Another historian describes seeing sort of blackened rocks towards the summit of Vesuvius, but he interprets that as evidence of, he says, fires which had since been quenched. So there's really strong evidence here that if people interpreted this as a volcano at all, they thought it had been extinct for a very long time, which actually it had. There was no reason why most people living in Pompeii at that time would have expected this to be anything other than a mountain. It was very, very green, it was verdant, it was covered in crops, seeing people were growing grapevines all the way up it. People didn't see it as a threat. Were there warnings before the Pompeii eruption? Yes, we know that in the days immediately leading up to the volcanic eruption, there were a series of earth tremors or small earthquakes which shook Pompeii. And these would have been quite alarming in themselves because about 17 years earlier, there'd been a really catastrophic earthquake which had caused a lot of damage to buildings within Pompeii. And Pompeii was still in the process of being rebuilt. There were still things which were being fixed and sort of replenished as a result of that. And what people didn't realise was that earlier earthquake was caused by magma beginning to rise up within the volcano. The volcano was beginning to wake up, but there was no reason why anyone would have put two and two together and associated the two disasters. When did Pompeii erupt? This is a more complicated question than it looks. We can say definitively that it erupted in AD 79, but the exact timing of the eruption is still uncertain because our eyewitness accounts are two letters written by Pliny the Younger to the historian Tacitus, and a number of different manuscripts of these letters have come down to us, and lots of these manuscripts say completely different dates. So scholars who specialise in reading manuscripts have said that the date that looks the most secure within these manuscripts is the 24th of August. So 24th of August AD 79 is the traditional date you'll find in a lot of old books about the eruption of Vesuvius. But more recently, archaeological evidence seems to suggest that the eruption took place later in the year. In particular, we can see that there were still leaves on the trees, but things like olives and figs and pomegranates had all been harvested, and that usually took place in September or October, not in August. The wind direction seems to have been sort of accordant with what would happen normally later into autumn. And probably most excitingly, we have a charcoal message that's written on the side of a villa, and that gives us a date. It says on the 17th of October, or the Roman equivalent, he ate rather a lot, or something very sort of mundane like that. And bear in mind that charcoal just doesn't really survive for very long. It only takes some rainwater to wash it away. So it couldn't have referred to the previous October. It must refer to October AD 79. So it seems very likely that the volcano erupted after the 17th of October AD 79. Next question. How did the Pompeii eruption happen? We know from the letter of Pliny the Younger that the eruption began with the appearance of a vast cloud emerging from the top of Vesuvius. And this cloud was almost like a mushroom cloud. It was pine tree shaped in the description of Pliny the Younger. So it sort of billowed outwards. And it got higher and higher and higher, and volcanologists today speak of it exceeding 30 kilometres in height. Once that had happened, the dust contained within this cloud began to rain down quite heavily, and the pumice from it actually formed island-like masses on the water. So when people were trying to escape on the water, they found that their paths were actually impeded by what was coming from the top of this cloud. Gradually that cloud sort of gave way, and what you had after it collapsed was a series of pyroclastic surges coming out of the volcano. So the whole nature of the eruption changed as it went on. So there was a whole series of events which had kind of began with this earthquake 17 years earlier, then a sort of series of smaller earthquakes in the sort of immediate days leading up to it, and then sort of the Big Bang itself. So it was quite a drawn out process. Next question. Was there lava in Pompeii? No, and this is actually quite surprising for a lot of people. There wasn't actually lava in this particular type of eruption. It was a different kind of eruption which was dominated by stones, by dust, by, we call it a nuée ardente, these particular types of cloud which come down the mountainside. They're sort of balls of gas and rock, but absolutely no lava. Next question. Was there a tsunami in Pompeii? Now this question possibly comes from the film Pompeii, which features a very, very dramatic tsunami. It might also derive from the fact that our eyewitness, Pliny the Younger, describes the sea as being sucked back in upon the seabed, and there being sort of a load of sort of fish being left behind. But it's very unlikely that what he was describing was actually a tsunami. Probably this was an effect of the earthquakes, which were really sort of causing a lot of chaos in the region of the Bay of Naples. There's no great evidence archaeologically for a tsunami. There's no sort of evidence of rising water, of sort of watermarks, of marine life being sort of stranded in areas where you wouldn't expect it to be found. So I would say very, very unlikely that there was a tsunami in Pompeii during the eruption. Another question, did the Pompeii victims suffer? This is actually a horrible question to answer because in many cases the answer is yes, people did suffer during the eruption. This is because the nature of the eruption was such, it really depended on when you were struck and exactly where you were at that moment in time. There were a variety of different deaths. So looking at some of the victims of Vesuvius, you'll see that they have very sort of clenched fists like this. You call it kind of a boxer pose. And that is evidence that those people suffered from thermal shock. It's when the body reacts to extreme heat, the tendons contract very, very rapidly. So those people would have succumbed to this very, very horrible fate. There are other people who were caught up in sort of the extreme heat of a pyroclastic surge. This could be 400 degrees Celsius. And in that kind of situation, the human brain essentially boils. There were people who would have been vaporized probably before they actually knew exactly what was happening to them. There are other people who suffered from something like a death by asphyxiation. Pliny the Elder, who is our most famous victim of the eruption, he suffered from something like asthma as an adult, and it's said that his lungs were gradually sort of filling up with the ash and he was unable to breathe properly. So there are people who would have suffered sort of maybe heart attacks, sort of breathing difficulties, and sort of succumbed to deaths like that. Other people would have been crushed to death. There would have been a lot of buildings falling down on them. There's a huge range of different deaths and different scenarios that people suffered from during the eruption. So it's very, very difficult to generalise, but yes, people did sadly, very tragically suffer during the eruption. Another question, possibly my favourite question: why did Pompeii victims turn to stone? People didn't actually turn to stone in the eruption of Vesuvius. What this question refers to is the fact that we actually have casts created, so people who look like they're made of stone from Pompeii. In the Victorian period, it was discovered that actually the people who had been covered over very, very well by the dust and the debris of the volcano had left an imprint of their body within that debris. And after their bodies decomposed, this is what was left behind. So very, very cleverly, archaeologists went in and discovered that they could actually pour plaster of Paris into these sort of mould-like shapes to create a 3D recreation of these victims in their final moments. And a lot of these casts are tremendous. They really capture the detail. They show what people were wearing, they show their jewellery, quite often they show their final positions. So what we see are actually casts of people. They're not actually people who've become stone themselves. Next question. How long did the Pompeii eruption last? We're told that the first signs of the eruption were seen around lunchtime. So the appearance of a great cloud was spotted by Pliny the Elder's sister, called Plinia. And this was on a faraway base. This is about 30 kilometres away in a place called Misenum, so not right underneath the volcano. Possibly it would have been visible even earlier than that, probably likely to have been visible earlier than that in Pompeii, in the places that were closer. So it's starting kind of late morning, lunchtime sort of time. It carried on throughout the afternoon with the pumice fall, all through the night as well, into the next morning, and I would say almost certainly into the afternoon as well. So we're talking somewhere in the region of 18 to 24 hours for the duration of the main eruption. There would clearly have been sort of aftershocks from that, like you would have from an earthquake as well, but sort of the main event is in that sort of 18 to 24 hour period. Next question. Were there any Pompeii survivors? Yes, certainly people did get away. We know from the number of human remains that there just weren't anywhere near enough to account for the entire population of Pompeii. People clearly did escape from the city. Our best known survivor is Pliny the Younger, who wrote us these letters describing what had happened. And he was actually quite fortunate within this eruption because he was in the Bay of Naples, further away from the volcano. He was in the port of Misenum. He stayed there. He was 30 kilometres distant. So a lot of people there and sort of in surrounding parts of the Bay of Naples were able to survive because they weren't caught up right in sort of the epicenter of the disaster. So yes, certainly there were survivors. How did the Pompeii eruption affect Rome? Well, Rome was affected by the dust that came out of the volcano. There was a great sort of dark cloud overhead. The sky seems to have got a lot darker, and the historian Cassius Dio says that the people there were really worried about what was happening. They thought that the whole earth had been turned upside down because it got inexplicably so dark. It wasn't obvious that there was some great sort of eclipse of the sun. There seemed to be a disaster even in Rome. And this sort of debris, this dust that generated, was actually quite deadly to people. We're told that people fell ill as a result of coming into contact with it, and I think that's entirely credible. New question. How do we know about the Pompeii eruption? We know from a variety of historical sources. Our main sources are a couple of letters written by my old favourite, Pliny the Younger, whose uncle died in the eruption, he wrote these letters to the historian Tacitus because Tacitus wanted to write an account of exactly what had happened in the eruption of Vesuvius. And Pliny the Younger described the course of the eruption. He described what had happened to him. He described the fate of his uncle as well. So these two letters, which he wrote about 30 years after the eruption had taken place, they are actually our only eyewitness accounts of the eruption. What we have in addition are sort of various references to the eruption in the writings of historians such as Cassius Dio, who I've mentioned in some of these earlier questions. Otherwise, we're looking predominantly at the archaeological record. We look at what's left behind, and that fortunately is very, very strong. It gives us a huge amount of evidence about the course of the eruption, about the scale of the eruption, and of course what Pompeii looked like at the time of the eruption as well. Next question. Why was Pompeii forgotten? Well, I'm not sure that Pompeii really was forgotten about completely. I mean, I think there's a sort of a bit of a truism where people say where something is out of sight, it's out of mind, and Pompeii was out of sight. The great glory of the city was covered over. But all the way through history, there was evidence that people were aware of it. So we know that people were actually starting to tunnel through to try and rediscover what was beneath and what remained of Pompeii, and also Herculaneum, a neighbouring town as well. And they were doing that in sort of the 13th, 14th century, probably earlier as well. They were doing that sort of straight after the eruption as well. There were a lot of sort of thieves who went in to try and steal things from people's houses. This whole sort of process of tunnelling seems to attest to the idea that Pompeii hadn't been forgotten. But it was really a lot later with the excavations that people began to think about it and to remember it in a lot more detail. Next question. Who discovered Pompeii? So after people were tunnelling through and sort of, doing their own little makeshift investigations as to what was down there, there were a series of sort of circumstances where people came across the ancient city. So, for example, there was an architect in the 16th century who began to dig for a canal, and he stumbled across a very sort of important part of Pompeii. And there's sort of this whole idea of trying to wake up the city and sort of rediscover it really didn't go away after that point, but it was only really in the mid-18th century that the excavations took place with any seriousness. This happened first of all at Herculaneum, and these official excavations started there in 1738, and then in Pompeii 10 years after that. And they took place initially at the instigation of Charles III, the King of Spain, and they carried on and they carry on to this day. So there are still people who are continuing to excavate and to discover Pompeii. Next question. Did Napoleon excavate Pompeii? Well, it's a lovely idea. I like to think of Napoleon digging down, getting out his spade and trying to find what happened to Pompeii. It was actually more his sister, it was Queen Caroline, who was interested in excavating the ancient city. She actually funded hundreds of workmen to go and start digging and start excavating Pompeii. So there was a real sort of resurgence of interest in the ancient cities in the time of Napoleon, but he himself wasn't actually there excavating it, unfortunately. So the politics of the time really got in the way of them trying to discover and actually make much progress with it, but it really kind of helped to set the process in train. New question. Was Pompeii destroyed in World War II? Interesting question. During the Second World War, Pompeii was actually affected by some of the bombing, but sort of incidentally, or sort of collateral. So there were some sort of incidents where parts of it were damaged as a result of the Second World War bombing, and that was in the autumn of 1943. Even more intriguingly, really, the following year, in 1944, there was another eruption of Vesuvius, nowhere like the scale that had been in AD 79, but nevertheless this was incredibly alarming, and sadly 20-something people did die in that eruption. Clearly though, Pompeii was not destroyed, it wasn't covered over again, it wasn't sort of a disaster on the same scale as it had been in antiquity, but this really was a very pertinent reminder that the volcano is still active, it is still a live threat to this day. Next question. Why is Pompeii excavations important? Why are Pompeii excavations important? They're important because they lead us to one of the most well-preserved cities of the ancient world. It's not really possible to see a city sort of in its heyday sort of thriving in quite the same way as it is with Pompeii. There are people who were really sort of caught in the middle of things. Life was really continuing full stream when it was covered over. This is why we talk about it being a city that's frozen in time. People were cooking, people were going to bed, people were doing all kinds of normal things. And there's nowhere else where you can really see this happening in quite the same way. It shows us a lot about sort of the building techniques in Pompeii. It shows us a lot about sort of the religious life, all kind of facets of life. And it's only really by excavating the city that you get to that kind of knowledge. It's all very well depending on the historical accounts. You can look at inscriptions, you can look at all sort of written accounts and sort of literature. But I think to have a look at the actual archaeology, what's actually been preserved on the ground, is just so important, because for most of Italy we don't have anything like this depth of knowledge. So Pompeii really is a key city. It shows us so much about the ancient world at that particular moment in time. That's the last of the questions. I hope you enjoyed this video on the questions about Pompeii. I've written a book called In the Shadow of Vesuvius, A Life of Pliny, which really describes a lot of what I've been talking about today. I hope you check out the book and some of the other videos as well.